Everybody, so glad you could join me. Today we're going to look at this important federal opinion that came down recently, finding that Donald Trump's use of the military in Los Angeles violated this critical federal law known as the Posse Comitatus Act. Two reasons to look at this. Number one, more specifically, it's because he's threatened to put the military into other, democratic cities as part of a campaign of intimidation and retaliation because they didn't vote for him. And number two, I think in a broader and perhaps more important sense, it exemplifies his view of his power as being unlimited. And this is a great way to concisely look at that. And we can plan ahead and see what he's going to do, whether it's everything from foreign policy to, domestic affairs. So we're going to look at a couple of pages of this opinion because there's important things that come out of it, such as how his view of a rootless and unlimited, Article 2 authority as president has no basis in the Constitution. We're going to look at how egregiously he acted. And there's a lot of historic things in here that are important, but we're going to get through this quickly. Okay, so first of all, we're looking at this first page, and this is basically, I want to give you kind of a background and framework for where we are legally. This was a case after a trial, meaning this opinion happened after a trial. So this wasn't an emergency thing that happened overnight where Trump is, sending people to a foreign country and they have to issue some emergency decision at 2 in the morning. This was a situation where both sides had an opportunity to conduct discovery, to get the documents they wanted, prepare their witnesses, and go into the crucible of litigation under the lights of the courtroom, and this is what came out. So this was a well-prepared situation. Now, this looks only at the use of the military and not whether the initial appointment or federalization of the National Guard was proper. That's a separate appeal in a separate case. So let's look at this. Now, you look at the first line, it says, Congress spoke clearly in 1878 when it passed the Posse Comitatus Act, and that 140 years later, defendants, Trump, Hegseth, and the Department of Defense deployed the National Guard and Marines to Los Angeles. Understand the National Guard can be federalized under Article 10 of Title 10 of the United States statutes. And that's what happened here. They became Task Force 51 to quell a rebellion and ensure that federal immigration law was enforced. There were indeed protests in LA, but it wasn't out of control. And the evidence at trial established that the defendants systematically did things, if you look at that second paragraph, that constitute engaging in local law enforcement, doing things that the local government is empowered to do under the Constitution, and that exclusively belongs to them in the absence of extreme circumstances that did not exist here. So that's background. Now, this is important to look at the history of the Posse Comitatus Act because it's integral to who we are as a people. In fact, if you look at where it says founding era, the presence and rule of British troops in the colonies gave rise to some of the first American criticisms of domestic use of the military troops in peacetime. And how the British used the troops in America and how they abused people and how they, regulated the colonies in the very same way that Donald Trump is doing now is pretty much one of the main reasons we actually have in America today. It is a reason for the Revolutionary War. In fact, if you look down at that second paragraph, it mentions the Boston Massacre, and at the very bottom, how the grievances that people had against the king found their way into the Declaration of Independence. So animating the entire purpose of creating our country is the same thing Donald Trump is doing now. And if you look at the Third Amendment, for example, it's a reflection of this. It says that you cannot quarter troops in people's homes, meaning federal troops cannot go into people's homes and take over their houses and live there. And that's very similar to, something we could possibly have right now. So very important foundations. In addition to the fact that they passed this law and that's the background, you also have a situation where the Constitution splits power between Congress and the president when it comes to the military. And this is critical to understand because Trump and everybody behind him always acts like he's the commander-in-chief, he has unlimited authority. That's not actually how the Constitution works. It says, if you see here in the second highlighted paragraph, but the Constitution gave to Congress, not the president, the bulk of the federal authority over the military, including the power to declare war, to raise and support armies. And right here, this is called the Militia Clause. Very, very critical to provide for calling forth the militia, which is the federal militia, federal troops, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. So it is that power that is a foundation for the Posse Comitatus Act. It is specific power that gave rise to a specific statute. Donald Trump nevertheless thought, as we'll go along, that his general implied power, which doesn't even include this, could override the specific authority of Congress. It is a crazy, illegal, totally unhinged from reality legal interpretation, if you could even call it a legal interpretation. And then secondly, so we've kind of gone through this and why Congress has the authority, what the basis of it is, the history behind all of it. It is also important to understand that in our system of federalism, the federal government is a government of very limited power. They do not have the ability to exercise law enforcement or prosecute people for things that do not affect the federal government or the country as a whole. That's why you have things like the Commerce Clause. That's why the FBI can have jurisdiction over kidnapping, because it crosses state lines. Here, what you can see is that the police power is the quintessential power the Constitution reserves to the states. Now, that includes the police power, things like zoning laws, things like regulating property, regulating things that don't move in interstate commerce, such as the cleanliness of restaurants, public health and welfare, things of that nature. And dealing with riots, dealing with crowd control, regular law enforcement within a city is an essential power reserved to the states, not to the very limited federal government envisioned by the Constitution and the framers. So again, as you go through this, you can see how inconsistent Donald Trump's exercise of authority truly is, contrary to the text of the Constitution, its purpose, as well as our history. Now we're going to get into the specifics. So Task Force 51 was the combined, National Guard and other armed forces, federal armed forces that Donald Trump, put into Los Angeles. And this is critical. We're going to look at this. This is the Task Force 51's own training materials. Okay? It says prohibited law enforcement functions. Now, it says PCA prohibits active and direct. Posse Comitatus Act is what that means. And it goes through everything. But you see those four things in red: security patrols, traffic control, crowd control, and riot control. Now, the reason that's important is our military's own training materials, they knew that this was illegal. Nevertheless, here's where we get into the first Donald Trump's clear abuse of authority. They were orally instructed that those four functions in red were subject to a so-called constitutional exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, which does not exist. Remember, PCA is specific power, specific statute, and Donald Trump's relying upon implied, just made-up BS. Now, this instruction, that there's some kind of constitutional exception just manufactured out of thin air, was first orally, then it was put in writing. And if you see the second bullet point, that is where it comes from. This is Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth from the top instructing federal troops to literally break the law in violation of their own training materials. This memorandum in particular, the second bullet point, asserts that wherever federal personnel go, Task Force 51 troops can accompany them and establish perimeter control, engage in crowd control, and otherwise perform any functions necessary to ensure the executions of federal functions and the safety of federal personnel. And as we'll see, this includes going 100 miles in this direction to like raid a marijuana farm and 100 miles in this direction to do some other immigration enforcement. Okay? This is federal troops just roaming around the countryside all over the place, not just in LA, which was the reason that they were originally allegedly called up. That's what they told the public. And just becoming this unlimited, wide-roving police force. All right. Now, this is dealing with the assertion by Trump, by Hegseth, by the Department of Defense, the defendants in this case, that they can just make up stuff, okay? That it's implied and override specific authority. And again, this says, see the court shoot this down so you understand how out of whack this is. Defendants' arguments mirror those President Truman made in this case called Youngstown Tube, Sheet, and Steel. They contend that the president's implied executive authority to protect federal property, personnel, and functions supersedes a law duly passed that's specific by Congress pursuant to its own express constitutional authority under the Militia Clause. I mean, it's like a lot of you may not have been to law school or practiced law before, but this is so outrageously ridiculous that it is just complete bad faith. And if you go down below, he talks about, listen, Congress delineated exceptions to the Posse Comitatus Act. You can't then come in and just make up stuff based upon what you think is your right to do so, just ignoring the law. Okay, going on. And then this is where we get to Task Force 51's behavior and how they violated the Posse Comitatus Act and what they did that was wrong. That was basically engaging in local law enforcement activity, which they're not allowed to do. They can protect federal property. They can protect federal personnel. They cannot act as a domestic police force. To start, the court observes that Task Force 51 was expressly instructed that it could engage in certain law enforcement activities, setting up protective barriers, traffic blockades, crowd control, and the like, the 4 things that were in red in their own training materials. Again, their own training materials said you cannot do this. Trump came along and said, well, you can just, based upon a made-up authority, you can violate it. There is no exception to the PCA for such conduct, and neither President Trump's June 7th memorandum nor Hegseth's June 23rd memorandum changed that. And then the record is replete with evidence that Task Force 51 executed domestic law in these prohibited ways, again, in violation of its own training materials. In fact, go down to the bottom, and again, the root history, the constitutional basis, the entire reason we have, the Posse Comitatus Act, the Constitution, written the way it is, the separation of authority over the military, is because federal troops are not supposed to execute local law enforcement activities. But look here, bystanders at multiple locations and even federal officials were unable to distinguish between the military and federal law enforcement agents. And all this points to Task Force 51 engaging in prohibited activities in Los Angeles. Like, you can't even tell them apart. That's how just completely in violation of this the military was. In fact, these violations were part of a top-down systemic effort by the defendants to use military troops to execute various sectors of federal law, the drug laws and immigration laws at least, across hundreds of miles and over the course of several months and counting. So again, the federal troops are allowed to be at federal buildings and for a limited period of time and only as necessary. These federal troops were just going hundreds of miles in all kinds of directions, as I was mentioning earlier. You can see the limited authority they have and what the evidence showed they actually did, 2 completely different things. Indeed, Secretary Hegseth ordered troops to MacArthur Park as a show of presence and to demonstrate federal reach and power. Now, this is where they engaged in this completely fascistic behavior, where they brought up armored vehicles and federal troops, and they literally stormed the beaches of Normandy, this suburban park on the outskirts of LA, in the middle of the damn day. There's kids playing, there's nannies with their children, people hanging out, playing basketball. And all of a sudden, this army, literally an army, storms this entire park and pushes everybody out. And for the purpose was to just intimidate people. And that's what this case proves. It was all about intimidation. It was all about exercising authority and establishing a power that they don't have to use in other areas, such as when comes to voting, when it comes to trying to suppress, free speech. That's how you need to think about this going forward and looking at it in a broader sense. At the bottom, troops also drove hundreds of miles in different directions to set up traffic control points so that federal law enforcement agents. Now think about that. When you think about what does local law enforcement do, the guy standing in the intersection with a whistle and a white glove saying, this way, that way. And that is not something that can even remotely be described as, a federal military function. That's what local police do. I mean, it's core to what we think about when we think about the local police. Then we get to this last stage. Moreover, defendants violated the PCA willfully. They knowingly contradicted their own training materials, which listed 12 functions the PCA bars the military from performing. And in fact, they coached federal law enforcement agencies as to what language to use when submitting requests for assistance to try to circumvent the law. And this demonstrates the defendants knew that what they're doing was illegal and wrong. And even if and this last sentence is very important, and this is true across all sections of the legal system in this country, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So if they made a mistake, doesn't matter, but here it was bad faith. It was willful. Now, the reason this is important is because Trump views, specifically what I said, and putting the military in other cities, of course, but it's also critically important because his Article 2 power, this implied, made up, it is whatever I say it is. Remember, he's been in the Oval Office on camera during press conferences saying things like, I'm the president. If there's an emergency, I can do whatever I want. Of course, he's always declaring an emergency. That's why he issued all the tariffs under the IEPA statute that was just found to be illegal in violation of his authority under the Constitution. That's why he's done, everything else is, I'm the president, there's an emergency, I can do what I want. And this is a perfect example of that. Look at how he's attacking, basically murdered 11 people in a boat in international waters off the coast of Venezuela. People who were at best committing a mid-level felony in a boat that could not reach the United States. Again, he's Article 2, I can protect the country. It's the same thing over and over again. So we need to understand that. This is what Trump is doing. This is who he is. And this is the same pattern and framework he's going to use going forward to continue to threaten our democracy. So, hey guys, thanks for watching. Go ahead and like and subscribe. I wanted to make sure to bring this to you so you can understand this specific representation in the broader context. Take care. Have a beautiful day.